should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went to the town of Nazareth in Galilee, to Judea, the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in the bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for him in the inn. The word of God.
Thanks be to God. The elementary class was studying Christmas customs from all around the world. The teacher thought that was an ideal opportunity to share the Christmas story with the kids. She shared with the class how Mary and Joseph had gone to Bethlehem to pay taxes. It was time for baby Jesus to be born, and they needed somewhere to spend the night. She told her students that when Mary and Joseph went to the inn, there were no empty rooms. She compared the inn to a modern-day hotel or motel so they could kind of imagine what was going on there. She was leading up to the part about the stable when she asked, "What do you suppose was behind the inn?" One little guy who'd been listening very intently began frantically waving his hands. "Oh, I know. She called on him. He says, "A swimming pool." Well, there was no swimming pool behind that particular inn. But it was, in back, there was a lowly stable. It's unclear, it may have been a cave, it may have been a hut. But however, it was a place where sheep and animals were kept. An unsanitary place at best. Certainly no place for the King of Kings to be born. But there was no room in the inn. In 7 Stories of Christmas Love, Leo Biscali tells about arriving in Bali on the day before Christmas. Now, Bali is a Hindu land, and he spent the day in the village of Ubud. The natives of the village welcomed him. They invited him to join in their festivities and festivals. They were having their own secular celebrations. At one point, Leo mentioned to his host how happy he was to be with them at Christmas. And the natives asked, "What is Christmas?" So he told them the Christmas story, the one we're all so familiar with. And the villagers were entranced by the beauty of the story. But one particular point really confused them. Why did no one invite Mary and Joseph into their homes? Why didn't anyone make room at the inn for the pregnant mother about to give birth? In their culture, room would always have been made for visitors. Leo left a few days later, and they were still puzzling over why no one would make room for Mary. Even before he was born, Jesus was rejected by the cruel world. Carolyn Jones shares a story about rejection from her youth. Carolyn was born in rural Georgia back in 1946. She was 11 years old when her mother died. Shortly thereafter, her alcoholic father abandoned her. She supported herself by working on local farms, cleaning houses, babysitting for neighbors, anything she could do to survive. she recalled one Christmas that forever shaped her life. Little Carolyn felt so alone. She hadn't really had a good meal in a while. On Christmas Day, the feeling of loneliness overwhelmed her. She decided to visit her best friend, who, in her telling of the story, she simply calls the preacher's daughter. She got to the preacher's house. It was warm and dry, a marked contrast to the cold, damp cabin where she lived. The table was covered with platters of lots and lots of food. For a moment, Carolyn thought she would get to celebrate a real Christmas at her friend's house. And then the preacher did something devastating. He asked if she could come back another day so that the family could spend time together on Christmas. Now I can understand wanting to spend time with family, but the impact of that single act lasted decades. Carolyn wrote years later, "I haven't been strong enough to find forgiveness for what he did." She goes on to mention others who have hurt her in her lifetime, but she says, "I don't hate them the way I hate that preacher, because they never professed to be loving and gentle and kind, and turned away someone who just wanted something to eat." Let's focus for a minute on what it means to say there was no room in the inn. This is no accidental part of the Christmas story. I mean, it's just the last part of the last line that Phyllis read, because there was no room in the inn. But it's not just a side thought. We live in a world where many people find no room. We don't like to think about it much this time of year. We prefer to think of fairies and sugar plums dancing in children's heads. Those are the happy thoughts of Christmas. But it is true. There are people all over the world who find no room in the inn. They're shut out, rejected. Maybe some are simply from the wrong side of the tracks. Reverend Andrew Fiddler tells of a Christmas Eve service he had years ago. A couple of strangers appeared. They were as huge as football linebackers. They both had shaggy dark beards. They were wearing identical denim jackets with cut-off sleeves. Their big hairy arms were decorated with tattoos. And they came up as they were kneeling at the altar of his sophisticated Episcopal church. As he came to them to serve them in the communion, he couldn't help thinking that these men more resembled grizzly bears than men. Well, if grizzly bears smelled like tequila. He served them communion bread, and behind them the chalice bearers served them the wine. However, the two men kept kneeling at the altar long after the others returned to their seats. The other chalice bearer, thinking that maybe they had been missed, served them wine again, which they received and drank deeply. Then they returned to their pews. When the service was over, Reverend Fiddler gathered up his wife and her mother, who was visiting, and walked out to the car, and it was just starting to snow. Fiddler's wife got in the front seat, his mother-in-law got in the back seat, and just as he was about to drive away, those two large men reappeared at the car. They only had their sleeveless jackets on, and their hairy arms were wet with snow. They said they were visiting from out of town, and the friend who had dropped them off hadn't returned. They didn't remember their way back to his house. Looking at them in the cold, he felt a feeling of Christmas spirit. Reverend Fiddler said, "It's right on our way. Just climb in the back." So they did, one on either side of his poor, uncomfortable mother-in-law. He said he doesn't think she breathed for the entire trip. When Reverend Fiddler let them out, he politely wished them a Merry Christmas, and they wished him a Merry Christmas back. And then as they stood there in the streetlights, he saw for the first time the lettering on the back of their jackets. Hell's Angels, New York City. From a known to be rough biker gang. He said his mother-in-law said nothing the remaining 2 blocks back to his house. She was probably unable to speak. They went inside and she said, "I've never been so terrified in my life. Please open that bottle I brought you. I need a very large drink." Looking over our congregation this morning, I don't see any Hell's Angels here today. But I would hope, however, if they were to show up, we would welcome them just as we would welcome any of God's children. There are many people in this world who feel that there is no room for them. Some are from the wrong side of the tracks. Some live in desperate parts of the world. There are refugees, millions of them, in Africa, the Middle East, refugees from Ukraine, from the wars around the world, from war and famine. They can relate to the story of the first Christmas. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. It is precisely for these people the Bethlehem babe was born. I said before, the fact there was no room in the inn was not an incidental part of the Christmas story. But in fact, I think it's the heart of the Christmas story. The baby was born in a stable because there was no room in the inn. He identifies with the least and the lowest on earth, even from the moment of his birth. He was left out, rejected. That's how he was born, and that's how he died. And those in the world who are also rejected are the very ones he came to seek and to save. Whether they are refugee children in Africa, or members of Hell's Angels motorcycle gang, or a poor, hungry 11-year-old Georgia girl named Carolyn Jones, who only wanted a warm meal with her best friend. To such belong the kingdom of heaven. By the way, Carolyn Jones became a successful businesswoman. She founded and ran CNS Paving in Atlanta. She passed away a few years ago, but for many years, as a result of her experience as a young girl, every year at Christmas, she would cook enough to feed dozens of people. And anyone and everyone was welcome to drop by for a Christmas dinner at her house. I wish all the shut-up people of the world could have their lives turn out like that. And you know, if you and I do our part, maybe some of them will. There was no room in the inn. The people of Bali were surprised that anyone would turn away Mary and Joseph under those conditions. What about you? What about me? Would we have turned them away? We need to make room in our hearts for all those who are troubled this day. The lonely, the forgotten. For when we make room for them, we make room for Christ himself. Make room today.